Hello. So in this section, we are going to learn how to query Arweave using GraphQL. On Arweave, all the data is posted as transactions. And with the Arweave gateway that sits in front of the Arweave Blockweave network, we can use a technology called GraphQL to query these transactions. Each transaction is made up of some data as well as headers or metadata. And these metadata attributes can be used in a GraphQL query to essentially search the entire Arweave system and bring back specific transactions to list and view. In our case, we want to search the Arweave network and find all the transactions that have the tag app name equal to public square. And then that would return all the transactions created in the public square. And then we would have to call those transactions by their identifier to get the data. So GraphQL allows us to essentially use these custom tags and other metadata to find specific transactions we're looking for in the Arweave network. So running a GraphQL query is by submitting an HTTP post to the endpoint GraphQL. And then in the body, it's a content type application JSON, and it has a query property. That query property contains a fully structured GraphQL query. In order to develop your GraphQL query, a playground area is provided via Arweave. So we can open up that playground using arweave.net/GraphQL. I will add that as a banner. You can kind of see that. Cool. Um, so if we open a tab at that endpoint, so we have it right here, we get this GraphQL playground. And the GraphQL playground allows us to essentially write GraphQL queries against the Arweave network and get results. And we can kind of, as developers, build out the query that we want. So when we first start, we can just write a query, and we can use control space, and a pop-up will show up, and it'll give us kind of the documentation or the schema that we can use on this GraphQL server. We can also go over to the right here and click on schema, and we can kind of see the schema that's available there. And then we can click on docs and see a little bit nicer documentation. So here we want to get transactions, and just like any blockchain, Arweave uses transactions, and then those transactions are stored in a block, and then that block is chained to the previous block, right? So you can also search for specific blocks, which would give you a list of transactions that are included in that block. But most of the time for our application, we'll be querying transactions. And what we'll want to do is, you know, find transactions that match a certain tag filter. So, and we'll get edges back. And then in those edges, there will be a node. Uh, and then in that node, we get access to our transaction data. So um, that's pretty cool. And these docs can can help. But I think once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to just do control space and say, I want transactions, and then I want tags, and the help helps a lot. So there we go. We're gonna do name. And the one thing that gets me all the time is you got to use double quotes in GraphQL, no single quotes. So with name, we want to say app name, and then values is an array of items, and we want to say public square, right? And they are case sensitive. So that's kind of our input to our query function, right? And now we've got to define our output. And the great thing about GraphQL is you can define exactly what you want to get back. And in this case, we have to start with edges, right? And then we're going to get a node, and then we'll just get back the ID, right, for starters. So in this query, we're looking for all the transactions that have a tag of name, app name, and value public square. And we're just going to get the transaction ID of those. So if we hit run, it gives us, and by default, it gives us 10 transactions. Now we can add another input here called first, and we can request up to 100 um, transactions. So with Arweave, it's only set up to give a max of 100, and then you'd have to use pagination to get the rest of the results, right? So you would have like a load more button that would get the rest. Now, we're getting the first 100. Let's just change it back to the first 10. Either way, both are pretty fast, but see some other options on the output. So the transaction ID is one option. We can also get back tags and the name and the value, right? We can also get back the owner and the address, okay? And we can get back the block, right? And the ID of that block and timestamp of that block. Okay? So we have access to a lot of data in GraphQL, which is really cool. We can leverage that in our application. So here, this example shows us getting the ID and the tags. Now we can take that GraphQL query and put it into our code and use essentially a fetch or an Axios post to call the GraphQL endpoint and return our results, just like we're doing with the playground. Um, so one of the benefits of GraphQL is any kind of HTTP library can interact with it. So you don't have to use anything that's special with Arweave. Um, okay, hide that for now. And yeah, if I can, nope. Okay. Anyway, sorry if my camera is blocking the text. I'll try to keep it up to the top. Okay. So the basic gist of understanding a GraphQL query is you have the keyword query and then followed by the schema type, in this case, transactions. Then you have some filter criteria, and then you have the structure of the results. So if we look at the playground, we see we have the schema name, transactions, and then we have some filter criteria, and then we have the results. And we can choose what kind of shape. And you'll notice over here on the right that the results come back and you have data, so it'll always come back with data, and then the shape will mirror the shape of your output. So we'll have transactions, edges, node, ID, owner, etc. So it mirrors that shape. All right. Okay. One thing of note, the public square protocol that we'll be using was created by the Arweave team founder, Sam Williams. You can access it through this GitHub snippet. It's pretty cool, but you won't really need to know much for this tutorial, but you should check that out. You'll notice that GraphQL only returns the header properties, right? We don't get the actual data. So in order to get the data, we'll have to take the transaction ID and just call arweave.net with the transaction ID. So if we want to look at the data of this transaction ID right here, I'm just going to copy that, and then in a new tab, I'm going to type arweave.net slash and then the transaction ID. And because it's plain text, it's going to come back and show in the screen, right? So pretty cool. And if we want to look at this one, right, instead of the lyrics to Guns N' Roses, Welcome to the Jungle, we can pull this one up and you'll see, whoa, that's pretty cool. Nice. All right. So hopefully you know a little bit about GraphQL, but let's look at how that's going to work in our public square application. So if you want to dig more into everything you can do with the Arweave HTTP API, check out the API documentation. But for the most part, we're going to use an Arweave JS library to do our stuff. But before we get started with that, we're going to head over to our project and open it up in Visual Studio Code, and we're going to work on the um, the Arweave query. We're going to create our first um, Arweave query in our app. So let's go over to our project and let's open up source lib.js. And we have this function on line 23 called build query. So we're going to get rid of this const query object, or actually we can just edit it, right? So we're going to edit that. And like we said, when we submit an object, it's got to have the keyword query, and then it's got the GraphQL query. So we're going to use the backtick so that we can kind of type out the query. And if we need to kind of inject any kind of data points, we can do that. But for this one, we're not going to inject anything quite yet. So we'll say query. But at this point, everything inside these backticks should look like what it looks like in the playground right here. And we could actually copy that, but just think it'll be good to kind of see how this works. So we want to query transactions. That's our schema type. And we want to get the first 100. And we'll add a comma. And we'll say we want to get some tags. And we want the tags. And that's a good question. So we want to get two tags. One is the app name. That's public square. And then the other is content type text plain. And the reason we want to get content type text plain, we want to filter for that, is other people use this app and may publish content like images or JSON or other kinds of things. And um, when you publish content onto Arweave, it's important to set this content type to identify what it is, because that lets the gateways know what it is and it can distribute that data back appropriately to the browser or to your application. Um, so we're gonna do, and let's just make sure that this works. I should be able to do an array, and I'm sure it works. It's in the documentation, but let's make sure. Array, content type, values, um, text, plain, right? And then end array. Okay, cool. So that way I can add multiple tags that I want to filter on, and that's what we want to do. So we want an array here, and we want to say name, and remember double quotes, app dash name, values, and it's plural because this array, we could add multiple values. Like we could say public square, public uh, cube, whatever. So we could add multiple values here. We don't have to just limit to just one, which is kind of cool. And then we'll do name, content type, values, text slash plain, right? Cool. So we've got our filter criteria, and now we just have to define our output of what we want returned. So we want edges, and we want a node, and on that node we want the ID, the owner address, the data size, the block height and timestamp, and tags, name and value. That's what we want. Cool. So we've got our build query function. Now this function just basically takes this string and returns it. So what we'll do next is we'll actually implement um, the Arweave JS library so we can use it to query the Arweave network with this query that we just created. Um, all right, so that's it for this topic. And then the next topic will be integrating Arweave JS.